So who gets to decide who belongs to a community? Is it about your faith, your race, your family tree? And what happens when a definition, one that was set down in a colonial court more than 100 years ago, slams right into the fundamental rights we have today? Well, that is the exact question India's Supreme Court is tackling right now. You see, there's a huge legal battle brewing. It's putting modern rights up against a definition of Parsi identity that was decided way back in 1908. Think about that. A ruling from the time of the British Raj is still being used to decide who's in and who's out of one of India's oldest communities. And a lot of people are saying, hey, maybe it's time for a change. This case really brings two incredibly powerful ideas into a head-on collision. On one side, you've got the right of a minority community to protect its own unique identity. But on the other, you have the Constitution, which guarantees gender equality for every single citizen. So let's break down this complex and, frankly, fascinating challenge. All right, here's our roadmap. First, we're going to look at the case that's in front of the Supreme Court right now. Then we'll travel back in time to that original 1908 precedent. After that, we'll unpack the really crucial distinction the court made between race and religion. We'll explore the modern constitutional challenge, and finally, we'll look at what's truly at stake here for everyone involved. Okay, let's dive right in. So, this whole thing kicked off when a case was brought to the Supreme Court by a minor child, represented by his mom. Now, she is a Parsi Zoroastrian woman, but she married a non-Parsi man. And their petition, it challenges the very basis of how Parsi identity has been determined in India for over a century. The heart of their argument is that this ancient judgment from 1908 is still being used to exclude kids just like him from the Parsi community. And they're not just saying it's outdated. No, they're arguing it's deeply discriminatory and that it violates their fundamental rights as citizens of India. So you have to ask, how did we even get here? To really get what's happening today, we need to take a trip back in time to a Bombay High Court courtroom in the early 1900s. The year is 1908. India is still under British rule, and the whole legal landscape is completely different. But a judgment handed down this year would end up shaping the identity of the Parsi community for the next 115 years and counting. The case was called Petit versus Gigi Boy. Now, it started out being about who could access community funds and properties, like the famous Towers of Silence. But to even begin to answer that, the court had to tackle a much, much bigger question. Who, in the eyes of the law, is actually a Parsi? And what the court came up with is what the current petitioners are calling a dual test. The court decided that being a Parsi wasn't just about your faith. No, it involved something totally different. Your ethnic and racial background. And this right here is where that colonial court drew a very sharp and very controversial line. It separated a person's religious beliefs from their community identity. And believe me, this one distinction is at the absolute heart of this entire debate. So here's the logic the court used. They said a Zoroastrian is anyone who follows the faith of the prophet Zoroaster. So technically, anyone could convert and become a Zoroastrian. But a Parsi, the court ruled, is different. That term describes a member of a specific ethnic group, someone descended from the original Persian immigrants. So one is about faith, the other is about your bloodline. Now, in the real world, this distinction created a rule that was, completely lopsided. Because identity was tied to lineage, the community generally accepted the children of Parsi men who married outside the community. But the children of Parsi women who married non-Parsi men, they were often excluded. The custom basically says that the lineage only passes through the father. So, the big question today is, how does a rule like that, one that's over a century old and so clearly gendered, hold up against India's modern constitution, a constitution that promises equality to all its citizens? Let's take a look at the arguments being made right now. The lawyer for the petitioners, senior advocate Percival Bill-Moria, did not mince words in the Supreme Court. He called this practice blatantly discriminatory to women and said it was a blot on the fair name of a community that's so widely respected and loved for being progressive. Okay, now compare that to the actual language from the original 1908 judgment. The court back then was openly worried that marrying outside the community would, and I quote, dilute and contaminate the Parsi gene pool. It's the kind of language that's rooted in ideas of racial purity, and it's just really uncomfortable to read today. So the petitioners are targeting the very core of India's constitution. They're arguing that this practice violates a whole bunch of key articles. They say it denies them equality under Article 14, it discriminates based on sex, which is forbidden by Article 15, and it tramples on their personal liberty and religious freedom under Articles 21 and 25. So here's the absolute key takeaway. The challengers are not asking the Supreme Court to make a ruling on religion. They aren't debating the principles of Zoroastrianism. What they're saying is, look, this is an issue of fundamental constitutional rights, and no community practice, no matter how old, can be allowed to violate those rights. And that right there brings us to the fundamental clash at the heart of this case. It's a really delicate balancing act between the rights of an entire community and the rights of a single individual, as promised by the nation's constitution. On the one hand, you have the right of a minority community to set its own membership rules to preserve its unique culture and its heritage, but on the other hand, you have the individual's right to be treated equally, without being discriminated against because of who their mother or father is. So, which right should win out? And in the end, that's the massive question the Supreme Court has to answer. This case is about so much more than just one community. It's forcing India to really ask itself how it defines identity in the 21st century, and whether laws that were created in a colonial past can, or even should, survive the test of a modern constitutional future.